Somewhere in the bocage of Normandy, the summer of 1944, a German Panzer commander peered through his vision port and watched something that made no sense. 5 American Sherman tanks, separated by dense hedgerows, completely out of sight from one another, were closing in on his position from 3 different directions at once. No flags, no signal flares, no motorcycle couriers sprinting across open ground. They moved like one animal. He didn't know it yet, but he wasn't losing to better tanks. He was losing to something he couldn't even see. He was losing to radio waves. The M4 Sherman has a complicated legacy. History remembers it as the tank that was never quite good enough, outgunned by the German Panther, out-armored by the Tiger. And on paper, that's not wrong. But inside every single Sherman that rolled off an American assembly line sat a piece of equipment that quietly changed the outcome of the entire war. It was called the SCR-508. It weighed 181 pounds. It looked like a metal box stuffed with dials and crystals and copper wire. And it gave American tank crews something no other army on Earth had figured out how to deliver at scale: the ability to talk to every other tank around them, clearly, instantly, reliably, in the middle of a battlefield. Not just commanders, not just lead vehicles, every tank, every crew, every private behind the controls of a 33-ton machine. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what everyone else was doing. The German Wehrmacht had pioneered the use of radio in armored warfare. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, had argued since the 1930s that tanks without reliable communication were just expensive obstacles. His doctrine was built on the idea that speed and coordination beat armor and numbers every time. And early in the war, the Germans had the edge. Their FUG-5 radios, fitted in command tanks, gave platoon and company leaders a real advantage over Soviet and French forces, who were still using flags and hand signals in 1940 and 1941. But here's the problem nobody talks about. By the time American forces arrived in North Africa in late 1942, the German radio system had a structural flaw baked into it that could never be fixed on the battlefield. In a standard German tank platoon of 5 vehicles, only 1 or 2 tanks carried a full transceiver, a radio that could both send and receive. The rest carried receivers only. They could hear orders, they could not respond. They could not report what they were seeing. They could not call for help. When a German platoon leader's tank was knocked out, and enemy gunners knew to target the vehicles with multiple antennas, the entire unit went functionally silent. The Germans were operating a one-way communication system and calling it a radio network. The SCR-508 was built by a company out of Chicago that most people in 1942 knew for making car radios. The Galvin Manufacturing Company, soon to be renamed Motorola, had been quietly developing frequency modulation technology throughout the late 1930s, based on work pioneered by the inventor Edwin Armstrong. FM radio wasn't just a different frequency. It was a fundamentally different way of transmitting sound. Where standard amplitude modulation radios picked up every electrical discharge, every spark plug firing, every motor turning, every shell exploding nearby, as noise and static, FM filtered it out. The signal came through clean. The lead engineers, including Daniel Noble and Henrik Magnuski, spent years solving the specific problems that came with putting sensitive electronics inside a vehicle designed to absorb enemy fire and drive through rivers. What they delivered was a 25-watt transmitter with crystal-controlled frequency stability. Where German radios drifted off their frequencies due to heat and vibration, American radios locked on and stayed there. Where German signals crumbled at a few hundred meters during movement, American tank crews were talking clearly at ranges of 7 miles or more while driving at full speed. The U.S. Army standardized the SCR-508 family for all medium tanks in July 1941, before America had even officially entered the war. Operation Torch landed American armor on the North African coast in November 1942. It was the first time U.S. tank crews would face the Germans in sustained combat. And it did not go well at first. The Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943 is usually taught as a humiliation. German forces under Rommel tearing through green American units and exposing serious problems in U.S. training and leadership. All of that is true. But German intelligence officers watching the battle noticed something they filed away as deeply unsettling. Even in the chaos of a tactical defeat, scattered American tank units were maintaining coordination across 50 miles of broken desert. Vehicles that had never operated together were calling in artillery, warning each other about threats, repositioning without anyone issuing a direct order. The Americans were losing the battle and still talking to each other more effectively than the Germans could in a victory. The 10th Panzer Division's intelligence section sent back a report that noted, with clear concern, that American radio communication was operating at ranges where German equipment produced nothing but static, and that every American tank, not just command vehicles, appeared capable of full transmission. They didn't know what to do with that information. When the fight moved to Italy in September 1943, the terrain should have negated the American advantage. Mountains scatter radio signals. Valleys create interference. FM technology should have struggled. Instead, it thrived. The same multipath interference that shredded German AM signals actually had less impact on FM transmission. American tank crews coordinated movements through narrow mountain passes and across ridgelines where visual signals were physically impossible, and German radios had given up entirely. The advance toward Monte Cassino in the winter of 1943 and 1944 saw American armored units routinely executing maneuvers that German doctrine classified as impossible without direct line of sight between commanders. They weren't doing it through superior training. They were doing it because they could talk to each other. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, every Sherman that came off a landing craft at the Normandy beaches carried an SCR-508 or one of its variants. The radios were letting American tankers coordinate with naval gunfire support offshore, an entirely different branch of the military, miles away, integrated into a single fire network. But the bocage, the thick, ancient hedgerows of Normandy, exposed one gap that almost no one had planned for. Tank radios and infantry radios ran on incompatible frequencies. The SCR-300 carried by American infantrymen operated between 40 and 48 megahertz. Tank sets operated between 20 and 27.9 megahertz. You couldn't bridge them in the field. The result was deadly. German infantry armed with Panzerfausts, single-shot anti-tank rockets that any soldier could carry and fire, could approach American tanks through the dense hedgerows, while American infantrymen nearby had no way to warn the tank crews, and the tank crews had no way to call for infantry support fast enough. The solution came from the crews themselves. Within weeks, tank crews were welding ammunition boxes to the rear hulls of their Shermans and mounting an EE-8 field telephone inside, wired directly into the tank's internal communication system. An infantry soldier could now pick up that phone, knock on the back of a tank, and talk directly to the crew. By Operation Cobra in late July, this field modification had been adopted across entire divisions. Operation Cobra, July 25th to 30th, 1944, was where American radio superiority stopped being an advantage and started being a weapon in its own right. Major General Edward Brooks coordinated more than 200 Sherman tanks across the breakthrough with a level of control that German commanders watching the action later described as appearing almost orchestrated, rehearsed, scripted, too clean to be real combat. It wasn't scripted, it was networked. German units from the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations, found themselves reacting to threats that had been called in by tanks they never saw, from positions they didn't know were occupied, guided by artillery that arrived before they had time to relocate. Panzer Lehr had entered Normandy as one of the most formidable armored divisions in the world. By the end of Cobra, it had been effectively destroyed. Most of its surviving tanks at that point were operating without radios at all, either damaged, dead, or never replaced after combat losses. They were navigating by visual signals in terrain where visibility was rarely more than 100 meters. The same army that had invented radio-coordinated armored warfare was now fighting blind. The production gap tells the story plainly. During the war, the United States manufactured more than 50,000 SCR-508 family radio sets. It also manufactured 49,324 Sherman tanks. The deployment rate was effectively 100%. Every tank had a radio. Every crew could talk. Germany manufactured approximately 6,000 FUG-5 transceivers for roughly 12,000 medium and heavy tanks produced. Full two-way radio equipment reached perhaps 20% of German tank crews. The rest relied on receivers only, or nothing at all. The Soviet Union had it even worse. The T-34, the most produced Allied tank of the war, typically entered combat with no radio at all. Soviet doctrine in the early war years had tanks following a lead vehicle and mirroring its movements. When that vehicle was destroyed, the formation dissolved. American Lend-Lease radios eventually reached Soviet command tanks, but by war's end, only around 1 in 4 Soviet tanks carried any radio equipment whatsoever. Meanwhile, the Motorola factory in Chicago was running around the clock. Each SCR-508 unit required 2,748 individual components. The BC-604 transmitter alone contained hundreds of capacitors and resistors, all manufactured to tolerances that the military had previously considered achievable only in laboratory conditions. Production went from 3,800 units in 1942 to 11,400 in 1943 to 24,000 in 1944. In September 1944, the 4th Armored Division met multiple German Panzer brigades at the Battle of Ericourt in the Lorraine region of France. On paper, the Germans had the better equipment. Panther tanks outranged and outgunned Shermans. The terrain favored the defenders. By every metric of platform performance, the Germans should have won. They did not. Over 3 weeks, the 4th Armored destroyed 281 German armored vehicles. It lost 41 Shermans. A kill ratio of nearly 7-to-1. Against an enemy fielding superior tanks, achieved not through better guns or thicker armor, but through the ability to share information instantly across an entire formation. Every Sherman that spotted a Panther could tell every other Sherman where it was within seconds. Tank destroyers received targeting data from tanks they couldn't see. Artillery observers called in fire missions that German crews had no warning were coming. The Germans at Ericourt were fighting individual battles. The Americans were fighting a single, connected battle that happened to span miles of French countryside. Here is perhaps the most remarkable part of this entire story. German military intelligence never fully understood what they were up against. A captured assessment from September 1944 attributed American coordination to superior training and strict communication discipline. The report acknowledged that American units communicated effectively at long ranges and maintained cohesion under pressure. It credited this to doctrine and repetition. It never identified the technology. German tactical responses never adapted accordingly. They continued targeting vehicles with distinctive antenna configurations on the assumption those were command tanks, not realizing that destroying any individual Sherman made no difference to the network. Another tank would simply take over coordination functions. They planned ambushes based on the assumption that separating American units would break their coordination. It didn't. Radio contact maintained cohesion, regardless of visual separation. They never developed a systematic strategy for targeting American communication infrastructure because they never recognized it as the decisive factor it was. By March 1945, American radio superiority had reached a scale that compressed decision-making in ways no previous army in history had experienced. When the 9th Armored Division discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact on March 7th, an unexpected opportunity that could shorten the war by weeks, radio reports reached 1st Army headquarters within minutes. Within an hour, divisions across the entire front were receiving orders to shift and exploit the crossing. The Germans, dependent on telephone landlines that American aircraft had been systematically cutting for months, could not respond with comparable speed. By the time German command fully understood what was happening, the bridgehead was already too strong to destroy. The encirclement of the Ruhr Pocket in April trapped more than 300,000 German troops, partly because their communications had collapsed so thoroughly that units could not coordinate a breakout. Field Marshal Walter Model's final communications before radio silence described a formation that had lost contact with adjacent units and had no link to higher headquarters. American coordination was by then so routine and so reliable that the Army's official histories describe it almost as administrative fact. Units moving, fires coordinating, logistics flowing, with the radio network as invisible and taken for granted as the roads. After the war, American technical intelligence teams evaluated captured German equipment in detail. Their conclusion, documented in Technical Intelligence Report number 176, was that German tank communications were approximately 5 years behind American systems. Not in one area, across the board. FM adoption, radio distribution, electrical suppression, operator interface. Soviet evaluators, given access to the same captured equipment, made a simple, practical decision. When building their post-war armored forces, they chose to copy American radio architecture rather than the German systems they had spent the war fighting alongside. The West German Bundeswehr, rebuilding its armored forces in the 1950s, made universal radio deployment a foundational requirement, a direct lesson drawn from their own defeat. Every Leopard tank produced has carried a full communication suite. The Gulf War of 1991 would validate the lesson again. Coalition forces with data-linked communication systems destroyed Iraqi formations equipped with Soviet tanks that were individually competitive on paper, but isolated in practice. Network beats platform. Connection beats firepower. The connected defeat the isolated. It is a principle that was first proven at scale, not in a computer lab or a satellite uplink center, but in the North African desert in 1943, by a 181-pound metal box bolted into a Sherman tank, transmitting 25 watts of frequency-modulated signal through the smoke and noise of a battlefield, and being understood clearly 7 miles away by a crew who knew exactly what to do with the information. The Sherman tank will always be remembered as adequate. Not great, adequate. But the men who fought in Shermans were never alone. They fought as a network, the world's first armored battlefield network. And that connection, invisible and unarmored, proved more decisive than any improvement in gun caliber or plate thickness ever could have. 49,324 tanks, 50,000 radios, 100% deployed. The Germans built better tanks. The Americans built something better than better tanks. They built a team.